Today, as you know, the theme of our History of Medicine year is living history. And for the most part, we've had first-person accounts of people who've observed or been patients or been scientists or physicians who've taken part in notable achievements or experiences in the history of 20th century medicine here at the Texas Medical Center. And today we have Eric Solberg, who is at the moment UT's Vice President for Academic and Research Affairs, and has been working in the field of tobacco, the science of tobacco, the politics of tobacco, policy of tobacco, since the 70s?
80s.
Since the 80s. And the theme today is the politics of tobacco. And one of the things we have not focused on very much in our series is the importance of understanding the politics, the economics, the lobbying, the corporate influence on people's perception of science, on the shaping of policy, because history of science, history of medicine do not take place in a vacuum. They take place in specific political, historical contexts. And today we have, as I said, Eric, who has worked in this arena for many years and is able to talk to us about the tobacco industry's impact and role in public perception and policy. To which I should add, this is exactly what's been happening in the fossil fuel industry and in the science of climate change in the last 25 or 30 years. The same kind of corporate sponsorship and payments and lobbying on behalf of certain interests that obscure much of the scientific data about the impact of burning of fossil fuels. So just a couple of things about Eric. He's been at the TMC for 26 years, 10 at Baylor, 5 at MD Anderson, and 9 at UT. He worked for a biotech company originally. He's trained in exercise physiology. And as you can tell from how fit he looks, he still does Ironman and still is a nationally ranked runner. His master's degree is in cardiac rehabilitation. And he's also going back to school in the last few years to get a doctorate in the School of Public Health. In his free time, Eric has often been a health and medical activist and is very critical of certain kinds of public health models, which I don't think we'll get into today. But he's always been interested in understanding the foundations of traditional public health models, and in particular, lung cancer, which, as he says, is the biggest public health failure on the planet, something we really have not yet learned to deal with. So what I want him to tell us is how he became involved in lung cancer issues and smoking and tobacco companies in his own personal life, and then to move into what he has learned over the years as an advocate, as a scientist, as a policy person. But I think the key thing from a point of view of living history is that Eric has lived this history as an administrator, as a policy person, as a student, as an advocate, as an employee. And one of the key points I would just say, that we were talking about this the other day, are not very encouraging, because what he talks about is the failure of public health models, the influence of industry on science and medicine, which has not been salutary, and the influence of money in the shaping of our public policy around tobacco.
So I got into this field completely by accident. I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota working in exercise physiology, and was training in clinical applications of exercise physiology with the Minneapolis Heart Institute. Toward the end of my master's degree, I had been accepted to a doctoral program there, but toward the end of my master's degree at Minneapolis Heart Institute, I saw a heart transplant This was in 1986 or 7, I guess, 88, somewhere in there. 80, can't remember. But anyway, it was in the late 80s. And it was a 62-year-old man with a 14-year-old heart. And that one patient has stuck with me my entire career. And I really needed to make some decisions at that time if I wanted to, continue a path in clinical exercise physiology or if I wanted to do something else. And I decided, with no foundational knowledge whatsoever, I decided I wanted to move into, sort of public health or preventive medicine, not really knowing what that meant. And so I started to apply for jobs rather than, register for another term in graduate school. And I was applying to, like, the American Heart Association, American Cancer Society, things that you would think of traditionally as being a wonderful, public health organizations. Didn't get any interviews whatsoever. And in those days, to find a job, you actually had to read a Sunday newspaper. So I'd pick up the Minneapolis Star Tribune and open it up, and there would be this thick section. And I saw this position at the North Dakota State Department of Health. And I said, wow, that sounds interesting to me. It was really running the CDC's behavioral risk factor surveillance system within the state of North Dakota. This is something that happens across all 50 states, collecting data on various health behaviors and then shipping that off to the Centers for Disease Control. The only person I knew in North Dakota, I was actually born in Bismarck, North Dakota, but the only one I knew that worked there at the time was my dad. So he worked at the state hospital in Jamestown. And so I called him on the phone. I said, hey, do you know anybody at the state health department? He says, well, yeah, I know a couple of people, but, the only one I really know very well is Dr. Robert Wendt, who is the state health commissioner. And so I said, great. I wrote a cover letter directly.
Tell us what your dad was working as.
He was the chaplain at the state hospital in Jamestown, North Dakota. So he hadn't really interacted a whole lot with the state health commissioner, but I figured, I might as well start at the top and see if I can get an interview. Sure enough, I got an interview. The problem was, though, that 3 days before my interview, I was going to drive from Minneapolis to Bismarck. I get a phone call from the state health department, and they said, we have actually filled the position that you applied for, but we have another position that may actually fit your experiences better because it deals with community health promotion, networking with regional or city and county health departments to promote health and exercise and diet, nutrition. And, oh, by the way, there's this, sort of 50% of this role is dealing with, how we deal with smoking and tobacco issues in our state. Would you still be interested in coming to interview? I said, sure, because that was the only interview that I had been offered. And so I got there about 20 minutes before the interview. It's a 6-hour drive from Minneapolis to Bismarck, North Dakota. And I didn't know what they were going to ask me. I had not been coached on how to sit or answer or respond in an interview. I just know that 50% of that job, they said, was something about an area that I knew nothing about, really. And so I was really unprepared. But as I was sitting in the waiting area, I glanced down at the table, the side room table, and there was a magazine, U.S. News and World Report. This was September of 1989. And on the cover of that magazine, it says, 25th Anniversary Surgeon General's Report on Smoking and Health. I'm like, wow, that looks helpful. So I picked it up. It was 2 pages, but there were charts and graphs that sort of provided some of the history of tobacco use in the United States, smoking rates, what contributed to higher smoking rates in different parts of the country. And so, like I did in graduate school, I memorized charts and graphs because a picture was worth 1,000 words. I walked into the interview and I blew them away because I was just regurgitating data that I had just literally read 15 minutes before. So they hired me, and part of my job was trying to understand, what not just the state of North Dakota had done on smoking issues and tobacco use and lung cancer, but really what was going on around the country. And so that's really how it started, literally by accident.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the Surgeon General's report and how you became familiar with it.
Actually, I brought a copy. So anybody who works in the field of lung cancer or smoking issues, public health even, knows about the 1964 Surgeon General's report. The Surgeon General at the time was Dr. Luther Terry from Alabama. The president, when it was released, was not the president who charged the commission to actually develop the report. So the report was released in January of 1964 by President Johnson, and that was, of course, after President Kennedy had been assassinated. But President Kennedy was the president who actually commissioned the report.
Sorry.
And there's some great Texas ties. So two of the members of the Surgeon General's committee that developed the report are from Texas. So one was Dr. Walter Burdett, who was a medical geneticist at MD Anderson for much of his career. He actually also taught at the medical school here in the 70s and early 80s because he had a joint appointment. And then a name you might be familiar with, Dr. Mickey LeMaitre, he was actually the youngest member of the Surgeon General's committee and is the only living member today of the committee. I believe he's 92. I'm not sure. You might get mad if I'm overestimating his age.
I think you're overestimating how many people know who Mickey LeMaitre is.
So Dr. LeMaitre was, so at the time he was on the report, he was a professor at UT Southwestern Medical Center up in Dallas. But his career included being the chancellor of UT Systems, the second president of MD Anderson Cancer Center. Obviously, he is retired now, but he is extremely well known throughout the state of Texas. Much more so than Dr. Walter Burdett was, who was, just a faculty member at MD Anderson and here at the medical school. So. Yeah, it's a little bit of background on Dr. LeMaitre. I've actually talked to him because he was writing his memoirs about what it was like to serve on the Surgeon General's committee. And the committee itself is very interesting. So the members of the committee were selected in one of the most... So there was some criteria. Number one, they could not have written or spoken publicly on the topic of smoking and health. So basically, the committee members had no experience, just like me, when I had my first job, right? So that was criteria number one. Number two was that all of the members that were being nominated to come forward, in order to get on there, had to be agreement that these members should serve on the committee, and the agreement included members of the executive offices of the major cigarette manufacturers in the United States. So they had to pass muster not just with, the Surgeon General and members of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but they had to pass muster and be approved, literally, by the tobacco industry. And at any point, any partner looking at these members who were being nominated could say, nope, that person's not going to be on the committee. So that's how the committee was formed.
So tell us, what companies represented the tobacco industry?
So it's changed quite a bit over the last 10 to 15 years through consolidation. But the name of the company most known throughout not just the United States but throughout the world is Philip Morris. So they still have major operations here in the United States. They're headquartered here. They also have international operations. They've changed the name of their quote-unquote parent company, which is called Altria. But they are the number one cigarette manufacturer on the planet, and they sell the number one cigarette brand around the world, which is Marlboro.
Huh.
Yeah. So R.J. Reynolds is another name that you might have heard. Some of these you might have heard growing up because Philip Morris used to own Kraft food products, General Foods, Miller Brewing Company. Now they've since sold that, and those are owned by other people. R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company had diversified itself to include Nabisco crackers and cookies like Oreos, Ritz, okay? And several other companies that they had acquired along the way. A lot of that was done for political purposes. It was really to disguise themselves so that people didn't think, oh, that's just the big bad tobacco industry. And they were very good at it. They did it in Congress, they did it in state houses around the country, had a very big presence in the state of Texas over many years. They were so good at disguising themselves that in the early 1990s, I wrote a report on lobbying by the tobacco companies in the state of Texas, and they had hired lobbyists who also represented health organizations in the state of Texas. So you've got somebody lobbying for Marlboro cigarettes and how we can increase those sales and reduce cigarette taxes and so on and so forth. At the same time, as representing Philip Morris, you have the same people representing, for example, the Texas Society for Respiratory Care. Can't make this up. The Texas Hospital Association at one time was represented by a cigarette lobbyist at the same time representing them. So many of these examples, we did a whole report on these back in the mid-1990s called Sick Bedfellows. And it was really to try to bring to light that it's not just the tobacco companies that we're talking about here that are part of the biggest part of the problem. It's those who are sort of in bed with them and colluding with them.
Who was the report written to, and what was the effect of it?
So the report was really done, it was really written for the media. We, at the same time, I mean, you have to remember, so a little more history here. So this report came out January 11th of 1964. It was released on a Saturday because they were concerned about what might happen in the stock market when this report came out. It was not embargoed for release, which means they gave out early copies of it for the media to review. The media received a copy of the report and the summary when they arrived to the press conference. They locked them in a room for 4 hours, and then they answered questions. That's how controlled this document was. So Dr. Luther Terry, when he spoke at the press conference, said, and the main conclusion in the report, I should have said earlier, was that smoking causes lung cancer. Okay, so it took them a report, 7,000 studies that were reviewed to confirm things that really people like Dr. Michael DeBakey and Alton Oxner, who were co-publishing in the 1930s, had already been writing about. They had already documented all of this by 1939. That really should have been when the report came out. Of course, you know, politics would hold back on that. Which is another good connection here. I mean, obviously Dr. DeBakey is well known in the Texas Medical Center for having, you know, been at Baylor College of Medicine for so many years. But the first sort of action, so the Surgeon General called for appropriate remedial action. And the first action came just 3 weeks after the report was released. And that was the American Medical Association. They said, we're going to do something. And what they did was they signed a contract with 6 cigarette manufacturers for $10 million to do more research. And that's all chronicled in this book that I contributed to, The Serpent on the Staff, The Unhealthy Politics of the American Medical Association. That relationship between the American Medical Association and those 6 cigarette companies lasted for 14 years, and $18 million later, the AMA finally said that the Surgeon General's report basically was right 14 years earlier. So, you know, I don't want to just pick on the American Medical Association because it was permeated throughout our country. The American Cancer Society, until 1976, was benefiting from a cigarette company-sponsored tennis tournament. It was called the Virginia Slims. And proceeds went to, named after Virginia Slim cigarettes. And the proceeds were going to benefit the American Cancer Society. It was up until 1996, MD Anderson Cancer Center, #1 cancer center on the planet, was still receiving research dollars directly from cigarette companies. You know, so the story is pretty sad. And I think one has to, I'm going to quote Father Thomas Garrett, who is a professor of ethics at Scranton University. in Pennsylvania, and he said, in 1964 he was saying this. He said, it's not just the guy who holds the gun to the teller, who's the bad guy. It's the people that are driving the getaway car. And I think in many ways the American Medical Association and many other major organizations were driving the getaway car for the industry. They were getting away with murder, literally. And 1996 is when MD Anderson finally developed a policy to stop taking tobacco company money for research at that institution. So, really you cannot make up this story, and the failure of not just the public health community, but all of us to really have done more to deal with the issue. The appropriate remedial action that Luther Terry called for in 1964 when he was Surgeon General, in my opinion, still hasn't happened.
Which is?
We've got to get people to understand that this is not your typical public health model of behavior change, okay? We can't go about, one person who smokes at a time and get them to change their behavior when you've got this other behavior going on with cigarette companies and health organizations aligning themselves in the most strange sorts of ways. And I think what we've got to do is develop new models, get away from traditional thinking, and really begin, I think, to look at this more from a business perspective, a consumer perspective. I mean, people don't go into the store and say, hey, I'd like to buy a package of nicotine. They go into the store and they say, I would like to buy a pack of Marlboro 100 menthol lights in a box. Okay, that's one of about 45 different types of Marlboro brands that you can buy. They're very specific. Is there any difference about any of these? No. I mean, different chemicals that are added. What color is menthol? I always ask this of medical students. What do you think the color of menthol is?
On the box?
Well, most people say green because it's green on the box and it's green in the advertising. For Newport cigarettes, Marlboro menthols have a green package. It's colorless. It doesn't, it's an anesthetic that deadens the throat so people can inhale deeper and smoke more cigarettes. I ask people, why do you buy cigarette brands that have a filter on them? Because 98 to 99% of people who smoke cigarettes buy filtered brands. And they said, well, it's safer. Safer than what? Than fresh air? I mean, so you would not jump off the top of the hospital. You just jump off like the 13th floor, right? But again, these are consumer issues that the tobacco companies have drilled into society across, our country and around the world. And we've got to look at it differently than traditional public health models or traditional medical models would look at.
So can we go back to the tobacco company's response to the Surgeon General's report? You said they started pouring money into other forms of research to disguise the requirement that remedial action be taken. So they wanted to kind of disguise some of the findings. And what kinds of research did they support, and what were the effects of their? So
actually, I'm glad you asked that. It's their activities in the field of research actually happened before the Surgeon General's report was released. So in 1954, after some major studies had been reported in the medical literature linking smoking and lung cancer as a causative factor of lung cancer, they formed, it was called at the time the Tobacco Industry Research Council. And it was basically the major cigarette manufacturers in the United States. They took out full-page advertisements across the country. And the headlines of the advertisements were, something about the cigarette controversy. And what they wanted to do was to build this notion that we just don't know what causes lung cancer. And they were very good at it. So they did it through the press. They did it through politics. They did it through aligning themselves, finding allies through the, sponsorship of research, basically. So they were doing their own internal research as well, and a lot of that came out in the 1990s when they were sued. But a lot of this stuff started in the mid-1950s, really.
Okay. Good. And when did the tide start to turn in terms of public opinion, public policy, smoking rates? Is the tobacco industry still trying to do things which obscure the reality of the science? Of course, they're still advertising, and that's what capitalism is about. But when did things begin to change? When did the tide begin to turn? Because we already know that in 1939 there was this definitive article written that DeBakey was a co-author on. Then we know that in January 1964, the Surgeon General's report came out. You got into this in the 1980s when not much had changed.
Right.
So what about sort of rates of smoking, rates of lung cancer, rates of death?
Right.
What populations? What parts of the country?
So it's fascinating, actually. So looking, when I was at the North Dakota State Department of Health, we were developing a proposal for the National Cancer Institute. And so I spent a lot of time in the state archives, the state library, looking at information and data. But some of the information was really interesting. So there were 16 or so states in the United States from roughly about 1885 until the early 1900s, 1910, 1915, that actually banned the sale of cigarettes. They just banned it. It was part of the temperance movement at that time. North Dakota was the state who had the longest ban, and they didn't permit the sale of cigarettes then again until I think it was 1920 or 1925. I haven't looked at it in many years. And so what we did was we compared lung cancer rates in the state of North Dakota to lung cancer rates in the rest of the country. And there's a 20-year lag time where you see that line increase in the incidence of lung cancer in the state of North Dakota. But it mirrors it exactly with the rest of the country. It's just 20 years behind. And that was because there was not a lot of consumption of cigarettes for that sort of 18 to 20 year period in the state of North Dakota. So kind of bring it up to speed a little bit more. I think after the 1964 Surgeon General's report, there were many, many, many missed opportunities. They're still going on today. And I would argue that the tide really hasn't shifted all that much. Huh. So the number one, so if you look at lung cancer survival rates over the last 30 to 35 years, even with a place as good as MD Anderson Cancer Center, okay, they are almost unchanged. 5-year lung cancer survival rates have almost unchanged. People now today, and so if you think about, well, the smoking rates have declined as a percentage of the total population. So that's right. So if you go back to 1964, when the Surgeon General's report came out, about 42 to 44%. It was certainly different between males and females. In some states, male smoking was close to 60%. Even among physicians at the time, it was in the 50s, 50 percentile. So, so smoking rates have declined over the years, but our population has boomed, almost doubled since then. And so 55 million people were smoking in 1964. About 52 million people are still smoking cigarettes today. Unfortunately, a lot of the attention has shifted now to e-cigarettes and vaping. So there's so much attention focused on this area. It's almost like, oh, we've dealt with the tobacco smoking and cigarette smoking. We really haven't. We've not really done a whole lot to change. Now, we've done a lot of things like moving it outdoors. So you can go to a restaurant in most major cities in the United States and you won't have a smoking section. Up until 1989 and actually until 1992, you have to remember there were smoking sections on airplanes in the United States. So in 1989, they developed a ban on smoking on flights of 2 hours or less in the United States, meaning okay, so if you've got a 6-hour flight or 5-hour flight from LA to New York, you can be exposed the entire 5 hours, but for 2 hours, we don't want to have it, right? It made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And so it wasn't finally banned in the United States until 1992, and then that didn't even include international flights. And I would say that the tide began to change a little bit when that part of the history came into gear. So there was a flight attendant, all right, some good Texas history. There was a flight attendant named Patty Young from Dallas, flew for a major airline. She still lives in Dallas today. She tried to get the flight attendant unions, she tried to get the airlines, she tried to get everybody to help. Nobody would help her. And so she basically took this issue on by herself. And all she wanted to do at that time was to ban smoking on airlines, because so many of the flight attendants who were exposed to it for hours and hours and hours a day were having incredible lung cancer, throat cancer, all kinds of health issues that were related to breathing in the smoke in the airplanes. And I think that's when...
What was the result of her effort?
So she was very involved. She presented it before Congress numerous times. She was very involved in getting the final bills to ban smoking on the airlines in the United States. She and a handful of others really did it on their own. It wasn't until much later that the flight attendant unions came in to back them up. Oh. So they didn't even get their own union to help them.
Huh.
So it was interesting. So I think that's really, when public opinion at least began to sort of take a different direction in the country. And that would have been in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when that was really beginning to form. They call it the anti-smoking movement in the United States. It's now got a big term. It's called tobacco control. It has really become an industry of itself, sort of a cottage industry. There's a journal put out by BMJ Publishing that I used to be one of the assistant editors. It's called Tobacco Control, an international journal. So it's really, if you look at what's happening now, I mean, in the 1990s, a big sort of public opinion change in direction was litigation against the major cigarette manufacturers in the United States. They settled with all of our states, including with Texas. Texas got $17.3 billion in a settlement, keeping in mind that when they filed the original complaint, they were only asking for $4.2 billion. The lawyers who represented the state of Texas, private attorneys, received $3.2 billion in fees. The UT Health Science Center of Houston received a $25 million endowment as part of the settlement. MD Anderson got a $100 million endowment as part of the settlement. Health Science Center in San Antonio got $200 million endowment as part of the cigarette litigation settlement in the state. People always say, well, why did San Antonio get $200 million and the Health Science Center in Houston only got $25 million? Well, it's because the Attorney General at the time, Dan Morales, was from San Antonio. So that's why they got $200 million. Dan Morales, however, went to jail. He went to prison because he tried to fudge, they call it fraud, but he tried to fudge a contract in order to get one of his friends who was an attorney paid part of the big settlement dollars. So both he and his friend ended up going to prison. Now there's an irony in that, because he went to prison, a federal prison in Texarkana, Texas. And when that's where the state lawsuit against the cigarette companies was filed. It was not filed in a state court. It was filed in a federal court in Texarkana because they thought that would be a good judge to get their case to go forward. And that's where he ended up going to prison. So now he's been out for several years. I think he's been out for about 10 years.
And what kind of endowment has he been paid?
It ruined his career. I mean, Dan Morales was a Democratic Attorney General. He was slated to be a governor of the state of Texas. He's been disbarred, so I don't know what he does now.
Yeah.
But
so can we go back to the question of why rates of tobacco cure have not increased? Why tobacco rates, why the survival rates haven't changed? I know you're not a physician or a scientist, but you would think that since so many cancers
right.
We've made improvement on, you would think we would have made improvement on lung cancer.
So part of the problem is early diagnosis in lung cancer. So it's very hard. So there's new technologies that have been employed trying to detect lung cancer early. So you have to remember, so 90% of all lung cancers are caused by one thing, and that's cigarette smoking. Okay, so that number hasn't changed in all of the years of the medical literature. That's still right. About 88 to 90% of all lung cancers are caused by smoking. So rather than doing something about, the cause of it, okay, this is sort of like, why we're in Central America killing mosquitoes carrying Zika virus, right? We're not going after the people who get it. We're trying to end the problem before it begins, right? So you go after the mosquito, you drain the swamps, so on and so forth. In this issue, that would mean going after tobacco companies, and nobody wanted to touch that. In fact, they wanted to take money from them to do other things. So there's been a major focus on early detection and screening for lung cancer. There have been many trials. There's a moonshot next door at MD Anderson that is focused on the technology of spiral CT, which can detect much, much smaller cancer nodes in the lung than had been previously. You have to ask yourself, how did we get on that track, right? So why are we ignoring the cause of this and really focused on the cure? That's a lot of the political history. Part of the cure, though, came from the original sponsors of the research for spiral CT in lung cancer were cigarette manufacturers. So they were providing the sponsorship dollars to major universities and cancer centers in the United States in the 1990s is when it was starting.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, even spiral CT hasn't, if you're not screening the population at the right time, you're not going to detect it early enough.
Yeah.
And so when they present with, a stage 2 or stage 3 lung cancer, there's not a whole lot that can be done.
So if I understand what you're saying, the tobacco industry had a financial incentive to support research into the cure of lung cancer, but no financial incentive to stop the cause of the cure because they were the cause.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. They did fund projects called, one of them that was developed came out of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. They sponsored, quote-unquote, behavioral research. And the end result was not publications in journals, but it was a big pamphlet and media campaign called Smoking or Tobacco Use, Helping Youth Decide. It was basically a pamphlet that could be handed out to school counselors. And it had nothing to do with the health effects of cigarette smoking or the fact that it is addictive. It simply said, how to address, whether or not you should smoke or not, right? So that was the only two options. They were, it was crazy. And that went on through most of the 1980s and all of the 1990s. To this very day, if you go to Philip Morris' website, you will find health information. You will find quit lines in states. You will find all of the help that you really need to, quote-unquote, stop smoking right on their own website. Now, they did this after the litigation was settled. They certainly couldn't admit this in court, right, that smoking was addictive, that it caused all these diseases. So that's why they settled. And then they were free, they could do all of these things. We want to caution all of our consumers. This is a decision that you're making. Just want you to be aware that there's, some harmful effects associated with cigarette smoking. So you go to their website now, and you could almost compare that section of their website to the American Cancer Society, and they're saying the exact same thing. Now, the American Cancer Society would say, well, no, because we're very critical now of the cigarette companies. And my comment back to them is to say, where were you for 50 years? You were taking money from them for that long. I'll give you a good example of where I think we've done a poor job of capturing the importance of this issue. So about a year ago, CVS pharmacies made a major decision. They were going to stop selling tobacco products in their pharmacies. Okay, the first question you have to ask is, why are pharmacies selling tobacco products to begin with? Not to mention beer and wine, but let's just stick to the issue at hand. So that would be the first question. The second question is, what would motivate them to do that? I mean, so there's a lot of profit in cigarettes because it costs about 8 cents to make a pack of cigarettes. Does anyone know what it costs to buy a pack of Marlboros in Houston? 5 or 6. You're getting warm. $6.43. I bought one a little while ago so that I knew exactly, because I gave a presentation and I wanted to know. But it's actually a trick question. I bought that pack in a suburb, okay, up near the Woodlands. If you go over here to the 3rd Ward, it's about 70 cents cheaper for the same pack of cigarettes.
So now we all know where we're going to buy our Marlboro.
Right. Drive over to the 3rd Ward. The point is, though, CVS it wasn't, oh, we're going to do the right thing and forego those profits that we're making on the sales of cigarettes. They were developing ready clinics in their pharmacies. And many states, in fact, most states, the majority of states, have regulations around healthcare providers. Some states even have regulations that say you can't sell tobacco products where healthcare providers are providing their services. So that was their primary motivation, was to bring ready clinics into their CVS pharmacies around the United States. It had nothing to do about doing the right thing, nor did they apologize. I mean, I've got photographs of CVS billboards promoting Marlboro cartons for only $30, not too many years ago. Okay, so it wasn't like they were just selling them. They were actively promoting CVS as the place to get your booze and your cigs.
Dr. Greenberg has a question.
I think there's state and federal tax dollars that are raised on the selling of cigarettes. Has that been a deterrent in any way to the actual selling of cigarettes?
So the question is taxes, and they've gone up tremendously over the years. It's over $1.40, I think, now in the state of Texas, something like that, per pack, right? So the argument in taxes was developed by economists in the 1950s and 1960s. So that little different sort of, disposable income, shall we say, back in that time than it is today. But those studies have been, referenced over and over and over and over again, to the point where no one references those anymore. You just reference the one that referenced it in 1985, and then the one that referenced it in 99 or whatever. You see how it works. The problem is, and if we took a different look, so that was a traditional, conventional public health model. Tax it and consumption will go down, right? So sometimes it has an initial drop and then it comes back. But if you ask people who smoke, and you ask them what brands they buy, what you learn is that the #1 selling brands are the most expensive brands, Marlboro being the best example. But so it's kind of, it doesn't make any sense if teenagers who want to look cool when they start smoking are buying the most expensive brand. They have the most disposable income. Whatever it is that they're making, they don't have any other payments to make, unless they might have a car, but most of them don't. So it really hasn't worked the way that they'd hoped.
The second part of the question is, what do the state and the federal government do with the tax dollars raised with cigarettes from selling it?
Right. So in some states, they have earmarked portions of those cigarette taxes to fund state health department programs. California being probably the most noted. They had something back in the late 1980s called Prop 99 that was passed by the voters in California. And they were the first state to increase their cigarette tax and earmark it to public education around smoking.
So the third part of that question is that any different from the American Cancer Society accepting money from the tobacco industry?
Perfect question. So now to this, I'm glad you asked that, because it's still, so the FDA, a few years ago, there was a law that was passed to give the FDA regulatory authority over conventional cigarettes, okay? And that includes the brands that were already in existence were not going to be included in this review. It's only new brands that were coming up. The FDA could then have some oversight. So just like the FDA model works for pharmaceutical companies, the pharmaceutical companies pay the FDA to regulate the industry, so too the tobacco industry pays the FDA to regulate whatever, and then the FDA hands that out in grants. I say it's no different. It's all the same. The money that we get in Texas from our taxes, cigarette taxes, and from the settlement, which, by the way, that $17.3 billion number, the B, that I gave you earlier for the Texas cigarette settlement, litigation settlement, that was just the number that they could put on the first 25 years. Those dollars are in perpetuity as long as the cigarette companies remain viable. So we're on the hook, literally. I mean, that's why. So, good friend of mine in New York, physician, Dr. Ed Anselm, said it best, I think around 1988, 89, when they were talking about these billions of dollars going to the States. He said, the most addictive thing about tobacco is money. And it is. What has happened now is, but they're still in control. So the cigarette companies have willingly paid these dollars. We'll be happy. We're settling with you. We're going to give you billions and billions of dollars over however many years they're in existence. And they have already shifted themselves. So Philip Morris, the makers of Marlboro, they make e-cigarettes. They purchased U.S. Tobacco Company, which was the biggest manufacturer of spitting tobacco products. So they've just accumulated even more. And again, the profits are through the roof, to the point that they can pay all 50 states billions of dollars every year, both in taxes that are collected and in settlement dollars, and still have money to dole out for research, give to the FDA, whatever. And I agree with your comment. It's no different than when they used to just give it directly to MD Anderson Cancer Center or the American Cancer Society. Now it's sort of, in fact, this question was posed by another colleague of mine. The American Medical Association held a meeting in 1997 or 98, and it was during the discussions with cigarette companies were going on about how much they should settle for. And the president, Lonnie Bristow, of the AMA at that time, said, we need to make sure that those dollars get earmarked, and donated to fighting smoking. And, again, this is coming from the American Medical Association, who used to get money to pretend that smoking didn't cause lung cancer, right? So a little irony there, but I think it was, what was so amazing about it was, his comment was, now they can get the money from us, meaning industry give it to me, then I hand it out, instead of the industry sponsoring the science. It was just ridiculous comment. It made no sense whatsoever.
There's a question.
Yeah, when did the cigarette vending machines get removed from hospitals?
Yeah, so it varied, and it varied by state. I remember in the state of Texas, I want to say it was around 91 or 92, because I was already here. Most of that was done voluntarily, although some of the gift shops were still selling it after the vending machines were gone. I know they didn't get rid of cigarette vending machines at the Astrodome until around 95, 96. There was a big push to do that. I think when Drayton McLean bought, the irony there too, because he's a grocer supply company, carrying cigarettes to grocery stores. But he actually removed the Marlboro billboard in the Astrodome in the late 1990s, and he removed cigarette vending machines. So Drayton McLean, I guess he was, making plenty of money trucking cigarettes around the state of Texas. I don't know the answer to that specifically. I can give you kind of a time frame.
I think Dr. Ray has a question.
So some of my students in class were talking about lung transplants, and they started talking about raising the legal age to buy cigarettes similar to alcohol. I suspect I know what your thoughts are about that, but can you tell me what they are?
Yeah, I guess legal ages have been a failed, I would say that's a conventional thinking kind of approach, because the average age for adolescent onset tobacco use is around 7th or 8th grade is when they start getting a hold of their own cigarettes. Not stealing them from their parents, they're doing that younger. but they're starting to find a way to get their hands on it. One of the biggest campaigns that both Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds tobacco companies both had throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the early 2000s was one of R.J. Reynolds was called "It's the Law." They had these signs on the door, all of these things that you can't buy until you're 18 years of age or whatever. So I'm not sure that would do a whole lot. So we have this incredible advanced therapies and transplantation center at UT Health, where last year they did 68 heart transplants, over 500 left ventricular devices, assist devices. I don't know how many lung transplants are on the schedule, but that would get back to my comments from when I was still in graduate school and trying to figure out what I was going to do. I just kept telling myself, if you can just sort of cash in for some new parts later on, and that becomes the main option, what are we really doing?
So are there any bright spots, number one? And number two, what are the next fights that are worth fighting?
The bright spots are the next generation, our students that are sitting in this room. Because I think it's going to take the next generation to solve this problem. And I don't know how many medical schools include courses that would even talk about things like this. So kudos to having this as a topic in the History of Medicine series. I think, so I really do think those are the bright spots. So I'm looking at, some of our younger people in the room, and, my telephone line is open, and I still work on this nights, weekends, and holidays because, I don't get paid to do this. It's a passion of mine, and if anybody else feels passionate about it, I would be happy to take you along with me. Number of students, for about 10 years when I was at Baylor College of Medicine, I ran a program called DOC. It was called Doctors Ought to Care, founded by a family physician back in 1977, actually, Dr. Alan Blum, who was on faculty at Baylor for about 16 years. He's now at the University of Alabama. He and I still talk daily. We have that kind of connection. But he really had the foresight, I think, in the 1970s as a resident in family medicine, to get the medical community a little bit more engaged. And so a lot of the stuff that we did when I was working with him in the early 1990s was working with medical students across the country to sort of, think outside the box. What could we do? We got them very involved in their local communities, and that was a lot of fun. So, students have interest in Reenergizing, love to do it.
More work to do here. I hope you all are listening. And some of it is outside the scope of medicine per se, right? Some of it is about lobbying. Some of it is about being vocal, in just the way you're vocal in public and climate change and in global health, being vocal and active in smoking, and in particular these kind of really difficult, long-standing corporate and political ties that needs continually to be challenged. Any other questions? There's one more.
So the cigarette companies were actively donating towards research. Were they influencing the outcome of the research?
I'm going to read you something, so let's see if I can find it. And I'm going to let you decide. Let's see. Here we go. So this is a statement before Congress in 1982. And the statement is made by Dr. Eleanor MacDonald, Professor Emeritus of Epidemiology, Department of Cancer Prevention, University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Center. This is her testimony before Congress against a bill to do more education on the issue of smoking, lung cancer, so on and so forth. My name is Eleanor MacDonald, Professor Emeritus. I said that already. I have worked in the field of epidemiology for over 40 years in 3 state programs in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Texas. In fact, I established the first state cancer registry in the United States from 1940 1968 through 1974, I chaired the Department of Epidemiology at MD Anderson Cancer Center. I have authored or co-authored about 150 publications. Okay, enough of that. I share the concerns of this committee regarding cancer morbidity and mortality, and I encourage legitimate efforts to control this disease. However, as a scientist who has dedicated her professional career to a careful study of cancer epidemiology, I am appalled at the belief implicit in Senate Bill 772 that Congress can legislate scientific fact. I urge this august body of well-intentioned legislators to avoid putting itself in such an untenable position. This bill is a misdirection of governmental energy and purpose because of its narrow focus on smoking as the primary cause of lung cancer. Okay, I'm not going to read the rest of it because it goes on for 18 pages. So your question was, did the money that the cigarette companies provide for research have an influence on the outcomes? And the answer is yes, because Dr. Eleanor MacDonald, for 12 years, was taking money directly from 6 cigarette companies while working at MD Anderson Cancer Center. That is how she finished her career as department chair and then as a faculty member at MD Anderson. Her focus of her entire career was to point at other causes, and Houston, Texas gave her the opportunity, because what have you ever heard about the ship channel and lung cancer? So there's always been higher rates of lung cancer in East Texas, Houston area. And she documented this in her epidemiology, wrote several books about it, published numerous papers about it, but she wasn't asking the question, which was, of the people who were working there, what was the percent of those who smoked? It was in the 66, 68 percentile for males, right? But she wasn't interested in that question. She just wanted to point to the air pollution from the petro companies.
And that was a question that could have been teased out if she compared the smoking group to the non-smoking group.
Yeah, sometimes they would actually list the causes of lung cancer in alphabetical order. So you would see asbestos at the top and tobacco down at the bottom, right? Even though, that's crazy, right? Who would do that, right? Interestingly enough, when cigarette filters were introduced in the world, but started here in the United States, in the 1950s, one of the first ones was for Kent cigarettes. It was advertised as so clean, so pure, used to filter the air in hospitals. It was made from asbestos. The cigarette filter was made from asbestos. It's amazing.
I think there's one more question and then we'll have to wrap.
So what should be the new model for funding of this kind of research? So it should be analogous to the global warming where the science is settled and therefore, we should stop all the funding.
Right.
That's it.
No, that's a good question. I would like to see more in the way of, instead of sort of traditional behavioral research, I would love to see some research dollars going into how we could really actually deal with the problem to begin with, rather than getting individuals to change their minds about some behavior they've adopted over the years. I think that to be honest with you, I think it requires an internal look. Both the public health and medical professions need to look at themselves and say, what have we created here? Certainly we've created a pipeline of funding because we've got the industry paying for it. So there's tons of research dollars now. You can go to the FDA website. We have a grant at our institution at UT Health Science Center, our regional public health campus, regional campus in Austin. They have one of the FDA center grants, $16 million over 5 years. Huge, huge. Now I will give, so Dr. Cheryl Perry is the PI in that, and I give her a lot of credit because she's using those dollars to actually study consumer behavior among adolescents. You don't see that much in the School of Public Health. So my hope is that people would do more of that, to take a look at new avenues. The money is going to be there. It's going to continue to flow. I think we can do, I would love to see public advertising campaigns, right? So not the public service ads. Those are the ads on at 3 o'clock in the morning telling kids not to take rides with strangers when the only ones up listening are the strangers. Okay. That's a great quote. Actually comes from Tony Schwartz, a media guru in New York, handed down to me from Dr. Alan Blum. But so paid advertising. right? Why don't we put our money where our mouth is? That's what the industry does. Okay, they're advertising. Why are we not doing the same thing? I mean, there's been small examples of that have shown success. We had an example of that in Houston that showed success back in the 90s, and I think we just need to see more of it.
Great. Well, I'm sure you will join me in thanking Eric Solberg for an amazingly knowledgeable hour with us.